Hello there, this is how to replace front and rear struts on any car or van. I am Robin from the Wood. Let's get it done. The tools needed are a 22mm spanner, a 30mm spanner, 22 and 13mm sockets and wrench. T45 spline Allen key, spring clamps, a vice grip and a 17mm spanner. Let's get familiar with the components that make up a front strut, starting with the locking nut, pump stop, dust cover and shock, camber nut and washer, coaster bolt, washer and nut, coil spring, retaining cap, top mount or saddle, numbers 13, 14 and 15 sit underneath the top mount, shock sleeve, sleeve washer, numbers 1 and 18 on the same locking nut, top mount dust cover. The last component is the camber bolt. It is identified by having a flat side. Moving on to the rear strut components, starting with the dust cap, locking nut and washer, upper bush. All these components are found inside of the boat. Retaining nut, retaining sleeve and lower bush, upper spring retaining cap, coil spring and bump stop, dust cover and shock, 17mm bolt and nut. Personally, I prefer doing the harder work so it's out the way. So the front struts will be removed first. Start by loosening the wheel nuts, jacking up the car, supporting it on jack stands and removing the wheel. Use the 13mm spanner, sockets and wrench to loosen the camber and caster bolts and nuts. These bolts and nuts are located on the wheel bearing housing. Loosen them, do not remove them. Moving into the engine bay, loosen the two 13mm nuts on the top mount studs. To remove the 22mm locking nut, use a 22mm spanner and T45 spline key to ensure the shock doesn't rotate while loosening the locking nut. Remove the two 30mm nuts on the top mount studs, as well as the camber and coaster bolt and nut. Once the old strut is removed, components from the old strut need to be removed to assemble the new strut. These components are coil springs, retaining caps, dust covers, sleeves, washers, and bump stops. Use the spring clamps to compress the spring and install it onto the shock. Ensure that the spring sits into the notch at the bottom of the shock. Place the spring retaining cap. After securing the retaining cap, the top mount can be installed by placing it on top of the retaining cap and securing it with the 22mm locking nut. Once all the hardware has been correctly fastened, the spring clamps can be released and spring decompressed. Installing the newly assembled struts is the reverse of removing it. Guide the two top mount studs into the slots on the body and secure it with the two 30mm nuts. Lift the wheel bearing housing to align the two slots on the strut. The camber bolt goes on the top and the coaster bolt goes on the bottom. Ensure that the studs in the engine bay are correctly fastened, as well as the camber and coaster nuts and bolt. Secure the brake line onto the strut, put back the wheel and tighten the wheel nuts. Remove the jack stands and lower the car back onto the floor. Repeat the process for the front strut on the opposite side. Moving on to the rear struts. This process is easier in the front struts, but requires you to remove both back wheels to ensure the rear axle stays level on both sides. Loosen the wheel nuts, jack up the car and support it on jack stands on both sides. Remove both wheels. Loosen the 17mm bolts and nuts located at the bottom of the strut. It is attached to the rear axle. Use the 17mm spanner and vice grip to loosen the top locking nut located in the boot. Repeat this process of loosening the 17mm bolt and nut on the rear axle and the locking nuts in the boot on the opposite side of the car. Remove both 17mm bolts and nuts from the rear axle. This will allow the rear axle to come down. Once the rear axle is out the way, the two locking nuts inside the boot can be removed completely and the strut should be able to be removed. The old struts would need to be disassembled to reuse some of the components. Those components are the retaining cap, retaining nuts and sleeve, upper and lower bush. The old dust covers can't be used. Start assembling the new strut by installing the bump stop on the new shock. Use the spring clamps to compress the new spring. Install the compressed spring onto the new shock. Ensure that it's in the notch at the bottom of the shock. Place the retaining cap on top of the compressed spring and fasten it with the locking nuts. Once all the hardware is fastened, remove the spring clamps to decompress the spring. Install the lower bush, sleeve and nuts on top of the retaining cap. Reinstall the 17mm bolt and nut on both sides that connect the rear axle to the strut. Tighten and raise the rear axle by jacking it on the wheel hub. While raising the rear axle, align the top of the struts with the slots in the boot. Install the upper bush, washer and locking nut. Use the vice grips while fastening the nut to ensure the shock doesn't rotate. Lower the jack that was used to raise the rear axle. Repeat the assembly process for the rear strut. Repeat the installation of the rear struts on the opposite side. Put back both wheels and tighten the wheel nuts on both sides. Remove the jack stands and lower the car onto the floor. That is the front and rear struts completed. I advise you don't heat or cut the springs on any vehicle. It is not safe to you or the motorists around you. Lowering springs are a cheaper alternative to coilovers. Be smart or you will end up like this gecko. The springs and the gecko are the same shape. Imagine.